Morning, everybody.
Hi.
So nice to see you all. Leo, there's a place right here next to Farmington. Sorry. So as some of you know, we had a trip to Japan recently. We had a pilgrimage. A bunch of us went to Japan to celebrate the 700th anniversary of one of the very important teachers in Zen. Can you hear me back there? Oh, good. It's working. And I'll mention a few things about that. Robbie suggested that I have a slideshow, but I could not bring myself to make you guys watch a slideshow. Some of you are thanking me for that. Yes, Zach, photo. Can't hear. Just up a little bit. I mentioned a really important story last time, so I'd like to start with that again. It's the story of, again, one of our really important ancestors named Ditsang, which means earth store, and his temple was called Earth Store. So that means the being called Jizo. Jizo means earth store, so that's one of our really powerful deities who guards people, protects people, watches over people in transition at intersections, at crossroads, and also from birth and to death. Jizo is a very powerful bodhisattva. So this teacher lived in a pretty small, remote temple in China, and it was snowing, and three traveling monks who were on their way to some important temple decided to stop there and for refuge because it was snowing so hard. So they went in and they were gathered around the fire, talking among themselves. And then Ditsang, the abbot of that temple, approached them just to talk with them and said, how is Buddhism in the South these days? Because they'd come from the South. So how is Buddhism in the South these days? How is it? There's a lot of discussion, right? That's what they said. Well, there's a lot of discussion. And he said, how can that compare to me here, planting the fields and harvesting rice? And then one of them said, but what can you do about the world? And he said, what do you call the world? And then the next day they left. They probably chatted some more, but they left. They were getting ready to leave. But one of them decided to stay behind, much to the surprise of the two companions. And this one, Fayan, went on to become a great, great teacher. But he said, there's a reason for me to stay here. So he stayed and became, again, a great teacher, just studying in this simple way, planting the fields and harvesting the rice. So that question, what do you call the world, is very important. But I want to turn it a little bit and say, what do you call reality? What do we call reality? And part of the reason for going to Japan is, for me, that question, what do we call reality? There's a bunch of things I don't want to forget to say to you today, so I have paper. So the Buddha Shakyamuni, the Buddha in the center of our altar, there are many Buddhas, as you know. So, but Buddha Shakyamuni is very, very important, and he spent the entire 40 years of his teaching career trying to help people see reality. That's all he did. And for some people, this involved a lot of talk. So luckily, Shakyamuni Buddha seems to have been a talker. That's nice. So he talked and talked and talked and talked. People memorized his words. But he also taught with of course, his actions and his movements and how he behaved toward people. That's all deep, deep teaching. And he also taught with wordless examples. So some of you know this story. Buddha was sitting in a mango grove, probably, sitting in a mango grove, and hundreds of people around. So they didn't need sound amplification back then because there was no ambient noise, so a voice could carry a long way. And probably people were really listening to the Buddha. But he was sitting and there were many people around. And what does our Buddha do but pick up a flower? And we think, anyway, we believe it was a lotus flower. He picked up a lotus flower. And lotuses, all of these beings, except for the Jizo on the left, but the rest of them are on lotus flowers. This is a very significant flower in our way. And why? Grows from the mud. It's a really beautiful flower and sometimes fragrant, but it only thrives in the worst possible mud. Sound familiar? So he picked up this lotus flower and turned it, twirled the flower. And then in the crowd, one of his most diligent, they say he's foremost among the diligent ones in observing the precepts, Mahakashapa smiled. And then that was a meeting. That's the beginning of Dharma transmission. And Shakyamuni said, he said, I Shakyamuni, have the all-pervading eye of the true Dharma, the secret heart of incomparable nirvana, the true aspect of formless form. It does not rely on letters and is transmitted outside the sutras. I now hand it on to Mahakashapa. So he could use words too. So that meeting, that understanding of this twirling of the flower is the beginning of this mind-to-mind recognition. And that word, the all-pervading I, is also said in Chinese and Japanese as Shobogenzo. So when Dogen Zenji wrote the Shobogenzo, it all goes back to that meeting. So that's one way of representing reality, holding up a flower. But there are other ways of this wordless transmission of reality. And that is one of the things that we got to experience in Japan. So this flower, we're kind of, I think many people who practice Zen, we understand this teaching of the care of small things. We understand that how we take care of what's right in front of you is your whole practice. We understand that, right? So holding up the flower has that meaning. This is the representation of all reality, the secret heart of the teaching. And in our teaching, there's also, in Buddhism, there's also the teaching of the boundlessness of all of this, the totality of all of this, the suchness of all of this, which is what Hodo is teaching in his class. Where are you, Hodo? Oh, you're back there. You were over here before. You're still over here. So there's a teaching, very important teaching for us with our human minds that tend to, at least some of us, our human minds like to narrow things down. All I need to do is pay attention to this. But our teaching is also that we pay attention to everything, to the totality of everything. We have a great sutra called the Flower Garland Sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra, and some of you have read this, right? Don't be shy.
Oh, not all.
Few people have actually broken open the text of the Avatamsaka Sutra. And this sutra is about the lotus flower. It's called the Flower Ornament Sutra. It's about lotuses, but it's also about utter totality. So there are many descriptions of the worlds, and we modern people would recognize this because it talks about worlds beyond worlds and the shapes of galaxies beyond galaxies. You know, there's a thing in our experience, I don't know, it's not exactly in our world, but the Horsehead Nebula, have you guys heard of that? It's a shape of a galaxy or constellations. Horsehead Nebula. And in the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is more than 2,000 years old, there's a description of the shapes of galaxies that are as far from our world as the sands, you know, millions of miles, as many millions of miles as the sands of the Ganges River, and beyond that, and then beyond that, and then beyond that. And all of those are also contained in one sesame seed. So there's this experience when you're reading that sutra of going back and forth to vast reaches of space, and then the reminder that that same complexity is in each pore of your body. And that's true. You know, the cosmos is in each of our atoms. And the teaching in the Avatamsaka Sutra is that in each of those worlds, vast beyond anything my mind can imagine, there are Buddhas teaching the sutras, and there are people practicing the sutras. And the same is true in each atom of your body, and each atom of this. So how do we represent that kind of reality? For some people, like me, I like reading those descriptions. So words work for me. But another thing that's really important is to go beyond words, which is what happened when Buddha Shakyamuni held up the lotus flower. It was beyond words what was happening there. And everybody in the room knew that something was happening that didn't have to be described. And then you feel it in your body. So, how do you represent huge totality? You make a giant Buddha. So we went to visit this giant Buddha. And Vairocana Buddha, Vairocana, we don't have an image of Vairocana here, but Vairocana means light-emitting Buddha. Just vast light-emitting Buddha. Very calm, but in this representation that we visited, whom we visited, he's huge, he's bronze, and he has in the corona around him, there are Buddhas that are sort of life-size humans sitting on the corona around this Buddha in Nara. Can you imagine? It's so huge and calm. And it's also in a very old, huge building, so you can't ever really see it all. You can't stand back and pretend that you contain this whole Buddha. It's so big. And on each of the lotus petals, which are like as big as, do you remember how big it was? It was so big. Each lotus petal is like as big as half of this room. And on it is inscribed a description of these worlds, a drawing of these worlds from the chapter called The Flower Bank World. Excuse me. It's amazing. So trying to represent in line drawings, worlds beyond worlds with Buddhas everywhere. That's what they tried to do. And you get kind of a feeling of it when you're walking around this Buddha. It's way bigger than my little mind can contain. So you just let go. It's so much bigger. And our world is just one tiny part of it, much bigger than that. And the story of this Buddha is also kind of heartwarming, the story of this representation of the Buddha, which is treated as the Buddha. It's, you know, it's taken very good care of. But an emperor, very powerful emperor in Japan, had this project started in 942. So long before Dogen Zenji got to Japan, long before Zen got to Japan. It was in the time of the really esoteric, mystical Buddhist teachings. And we went to that show of Kukai, right? So Kukai is the Bodhisattva who came from China to Japan with these mystical teachings. And in the mystical world, basically, you can only understand by experience. The words will not help you. So we continue to say that in Zen too. You know, it's a teaching beyond words. Why did you say that? It's from the esoteric tradition. You have to experience it. You have to be in the presence of something that pushes us beyond our tendency to just contain things and discriminate. So that teaching had come, and why did the emperor build that? Because he thought it would unify people. Isn't that nice? That the teachings of Buddhism were so important. This teaching of, when I was talking about going back and forth between totality to core, which also contains the totality, that's called the world of interpenetration. These worlds interpenetrate all the time. They are not stopping. He thought if he could get that message across, peace would prevail. But we're very stubborn preachers, you know. But the intention of building that light-emitting Buddha image was, if we could only understand that it's all interpenetrating all the time, we would stop our little selfish ways. Isn't that nice? We just stopped. So it took him a few years to build that Buddha, but the Buddha still stands. The buildings have burnt down and been rebuilt, but they're also magnificent. We paid our respects there. So our world, I want to say, is very complex. So hearing about this giant Buddha and these giant teachings is, why do we do it? We do it to help us tolerate the complexity of our world. It isn't to help us narrow our understanding or bring it down to this is good, this is bad, that's it. It's actually to help us tolerate complexity. It's really complex. And in the description of all of the worlds, worlds beyond worlds, galaxies beyond galaxies, there are many descriptions, not just the shapes, but the attitudes in those worlds. And the attitudes in those worlds, our world, by the way, our world system, depending on the translation, is either called endurance or tolerable. Our world is tolerable because there's a lot of effort made to wake up in our world. But there are worlds where everybody's living in peace. There are worlds where everybody's living in strife. It depends on the minds of the beings in those worlds. Isn't that nice? That's the Buddhist teaching. It doesn't depend on the rules, it depends on the minds of the beings. So complexity is our world, and it's tolerable. Today begins our practice period. There's our soon-to-be enthroned Shuso, soon-to-be seated Shuso. So this is our 2-month practice period. It's our 14th practice period. Isn't that amazing? We missed a few years at the very beginning, but the reason we have these is because we need reminders as a group. We practice together as a group. We need reminders to experience our everyday activities as practice. So this interpenetration of reality and the teaching of the value of a lotus blossom is meant to come into our lives so that we understand all of our activities are part of this waking up. So we set a time, and right after coffee and tea, I guess, we'll open the practice period, and from that moment, your life is practice. Of course, your life is practice now, but it helps us to say, from this moment, I am practicing. And then throughout the day, there will be reminders from our Shuso about how to incorporate these practices. We're going to focus on a teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha. I want to say a little bit more about Shakyamuni Buddha for the rest of my life. But Shakyamuni Buddha gave a teaching that Dogen picked up, and it's called, how are we translating it, Shuso? The 4 beneficial actions of bodhisattvas. Could be the 4 integrative Actions of bodhisattvas.
I like the 4 ways that bodhisattvas embrace all sentient beings.
The 4 ways that bodhisattvas embrace all sentient beings.
Yeah. But they're all good.
All the they're all trying to.
They're all good.
All the names.
Yes.
And the 4 are giving, kind speech, beneficial action, and how do you translate it? Identity action?
Identity action.
Those 4. So you'll learn a lot about those in the practice period. Confusing. Giving and kind speech seem easy, but what is beneficial action and what is identity action? You will learn. Another thing that can happen in practice period that I recommend is not just taking on all these things, but give something up. Give one thing up. Not something that you think is good for you to give up, just something to give up. Just sort of put that aside for the time being. But not coming from a punitive point of view, just, okay, I'll set this aside for this time. It's a very interesting practice. And the very first practice period happened because of the way Shakyamuni Buddha lived and where Shakyamuni Buddha lived, which is India, which has a rainy season. So otherwise, the Buddha was walking around northern India and teaching all the time, responding to invitations to take up residence. The mango grove was one of his favorite spots, various other places. But during the rainy season, they all collected together for 3 months. And that's the very first practice period. And those are now known as Ango, peaceful abiding practice period. So this practice went to China, and the reason for doing it is the Buddha did it. So if the Buddha did it, we'll try it. And then it moved to, with Dogen Zenji, it moved to Japan. And so we, those of us who went to Japan this time, and those of us who went the last time too, we sat in Zazen at Eiheiji, the same place where the first practice period took place. So we bring that back to you. It's very nice. Sitting at that temple, sitting at Sojiji Temple, and then even more heartwarming was going to Suzuki Roshi's home temple, Rinso-in, and sitting in that zendo, which is a beautiful little temple. Fantastic. Little compared to Eiheiji, quite a bit bigger than ours. But the family said, don't forget, this is your home. This is your home. You're always welcome here, but make an appointment. Very wonderful family. And we were on time. That temple, that family, it's a beautiful 550-year-old temple with a founder's hall, which, who was it who said they were really struck by the number of memorial tablets for families? Did you say that? Yeah. We have one memorial tablet on our altar there for Yazan, who passed away. And their temple has been around so long that they have walls of those, all with the name of a beloved person who has entered nirvana. So we now only have, well, we have 3, we have 2 of those, and we'll soon have a 3rd, but it will happen. In 500 years, this temple will have to add a little room with all the plaques of all of our names. It's reality. But what happens in that temple, what we saw, was the same thing we did here this morning. We clean the temple. We take care of it. The way we take care of our precious lives, we take care of our temple. We saw that there. And another couple of other things I want to say about Japan to share with you is just that we saw that care everywhere. We saw that the trees on the temple grounds, but also mostly throughout the cities, showed the relationship between the people and the trees over sometimes hundreds of years, that these trees had been carefully nurtured and shaped And some of them looked very formal, but some of them looked like, because of that care, the relationship with the humans, the communion with the humans, they were their real shape. And you could see it. You could see the spaciousness in the trees. So it's just a tree, but it was the relationship with human care that we were looking at. The same is true of the temples. It's a beautiful building, but when you're looking at a beautiful building, you're looking at the care people take of it. So again, interpenetration, taking care of the land. So Dogen Zenji took up this teaching of the lotus blossom because after a while, especially when Dogen Zenji was in China, this Avatamsaka Sutra is really big. It's about, how many, is it 1,500 pages long? It's really, really a page turner. I love it. But the Lotus Sutra became popular because it has lots of stories. It's about this big instead of this big. So the Lotus Sutra had reached real popularity, and Dogen Zenji loved to talk about the Lotus Sutra. He also talked about, in the background, Avatamsaka Sutra, but this Lotus Sutra is so important. And he said, in one of his, Dogen Zenji said about the lotus flowers, the Buddha lands of the 10 directions are just lotus flowers. Here, all Buddhas of the 10 directions in the past and present who abide in unsurpassed complete enlightenment turn lotus blossoms and are turned by lotus blossoms. So he's talking about the world of Vairocana Buddha, where the turning is happening in great totality. And when we say, you know, we say this all the time, all Buddhas, 10 directions. So if we think that that just means, you know, the 10 directions of this room, that's okay. So there are a lot of Buddhas in this room. But what they're talking about, what we're actually saying, is the Buddhas in vast, vast reaches of space. All those Buddhas. And when we say those words, we're actually inviting all of those to turn their attention to us in our tolerable world and help us. We got to Japan after the height of the cherry blossoms. We saw a couple, I think, but usually in Japan at this time of, just before this time of year, cherry blossoms are everywhere. And cherry blossoms are themselves a teaching, so that Japanese people, people who live in Japan, are getting the teaching. They love this teaching that beauty and impermanence are right together. They don't have to read Buddhist scriptures to know that beauty and impermanence are right together. They long to see the cherry blossoms and to get that teaching. So again, it's complex. And we, in the States, it helps us to hear these teachings over and over. Because we can forget. I mean, I can forget. You see a blossom, it's just a flower. I love these flowers that our Tonto did. Look at those flowers. It's like impermanence is happening right there. So Dogen Zenji loved this lotus blossom teaching, and he said, this is a story I want to tell you. I only have 2 more stories. He quotes the 6th ancestor in China, very important teacher. He said, well, first, the 6th ancestor is sitting there, like we're sitting here, and a monk comes in to meet him. In China, usually the floors were stone, just as they are in traditional halls in Japan, and people usually would stand during a Dharma talk, which kept them short. So a visiting monk comes in, 6 ancestors sitting on a big chair, big high chair, and the monk says, I've chanted the Lotus Sutra, memorized and chanted the Lotus Sutra 3,000 times. And Huineng said to the monk, even if you have chanted the sutra 10,000 times, if you don't understand the meaning of it, you won't even know your own errors. The monk, who was actually an accomplished monk, and we know that because they record the name. Fada said, I have only been able to follow the words and chant. I've only been able to follow the words. How can I understand the meaning of it? Huineng said, chant it for me. I will elucidate its meaning for you. So Fada began chanting the Lotus Sutra. And at the second chapter, which is skillful means, Huineng stopped him and said, stop. And then he tells him the meaning of skillful means. But then, this is the part I want to emphasize. He says, when your mind is deluded, you are turned by lotus blossoms. When your mind is enlightened, you turn the lotus blossoms. If you cannot clarify the meaning after chanting the sutra at great length, you become its enemy. Thinking beyond thinking is right. Thinking about thinking is wrong. If thinking and beyond thinking do not divide the mind, you can steer the cart endlessly. So this turning of the Lotus Sutra, then Dogen goes on to really, really poetically explore the turning of the lotus blossoms. When we're deluded, we're turned by lotus blossoms. When we're enlightened, we turn. But it's a dynamo that doesn't stop. And when Dogen finished his writing, he wrote this part twice. He said, when your mind is deluded, you are turned by the Dharma blossoms. When your mind is enlightened, you turn the Dharma blossoms. Indeed, this is Dharma blossoms turning Dharma blossoms. And then he repeated that whole thing. Basically, this is Dharma blossoms turning Dharma blossoms. So this is our life. When we are turned by Dharma blossoms, he's saying that's deluded, circumstances are turning us. And then when we turn and have an influence on things, that's the enlightened mind, but they're absolutely inseparable. They're both happening. This is a dynamo of activity. So Dogen and Shakyamuni and Vairocana always advise us not to disparage the deluded mind. This is our mind. And so to be turned by circumstances in the upcoming practice period, at the same moment, we are turning the Dharma blossoms. This is really important. We are that complex. At the same time that we're being turned by circumstances, we are also turning circumstances. And the kind of atomic level entry that our practice gives us has a big influence in this turning and being turned. So it's happening at a small level and it has profound effects. One other story about Japan. We were standing in a train. I think I was with Enrique. We were standing in our train and our train had left the station and we were looking at another train because there are a lot of trains in Japan. And we were in our train looking through the window into another train, and all of a sudden it felt like we were standing still because even though we're moving more than 100 miles an hour, so was the other train. And suddenly we were still in this vast world of turning. And then one of us changed speeds, either that train or our train, and we realized this incredible shift was happening. It was very disorienting. It was so great. So it feels like we're still, but actually we're moving and turning at vast speeds, and everything we do has a huge impact. Dogen says, what is usually distrusted is that now is a moment of Dharma blossoming. What is usually distrusted is that now is a moment of Dharma blossoming. I have one more thing I want to say because Stephen and I were talking about it recently in the office. Rest is important during practice period. One of the things that you may notice, we may notice about our lives is that we need rest. And to drive oneself into practice period or to drive ourselves during any day it's good, we have that skill, but we also need to work on the skill of rest and recognizing when it's needed. Shuso is going for a rest right now. In fact, I was talking to Tenshin Roshi last night, and we were talking about his next visit in February. We were trying to work on some dates for February, and he said he thought about not coming. Do I sense some unhappiness here? He thought about not coming because during the sesshin in February last year, he had felt a lot of fatigue. And so he thought maybe he shouldn't come because he'll feel fatigued. And I said, well, you should rest during the sesshin. And he said, well, I did actually have enough rest, but I still felt fatigued. And it turns out he's anemic. So now he's taking some B12 shots and he's feeling much better. So he's coming back. But again, everybody needs rest. Everybody needs the appropriate amount of rest. And finally, the turning. When we're practicing with the 4 beneficial actions of bodhisattvas, that's another place where turning will happen. So giving, kind speech, beneficial action, identity action, all those are actions that are also receiving action. So when you are giving, you're also receiving. When you're receiving, you're also giving. The kindness of accepting a gift is also a gift. When you're practicing kind speech, you're receiving kind speech and it changes your mind. If we practice kind speech, we're more likely to be able to hear it in other people. If we practice beneficial action, we're more likely to be able to recognize it in its complexity in other people. When we're practicing identity action, which means really feeling the connectedness with other people, we're more likely to accept their various ways of expressing their being. So these are, again, the turning of the Dharma blossom and the road to accepting the complexity of our life. Thank you all very much.